Maya Steele was the kind of woman whose presence spoke louder than words. She carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, the kind that came not from arrogance, but from hard-earned experience. A former officer in an elite special forces unit, Maya had spent years honing her skills under the harshest conditions imaginable. Her name was known and respected in circles where precision, discipline, and bravery were valued above all else. But now, after years of high-stakes missions and relentless pressure, she had chosen to step away from the chaos of international conflicts to focus on something more grounded: herself and her family. Returning to her hometown was bittersweet. The city, once a place of childhood memories and youthful dreams, had changed. The neighborhoods felt different, less vibrant, weighed down by a sense of disrepair and division. The streets were lined with buildings that bore the scars of time, their facades chipped and weathered, a reflection of the struggles faced by the people who lived there. But Maya didn't return for the city, she came back for her mother. Her once vibrant and fiercely independent mother, Clara Steele, had been diagnosed with a debilitating illness, and Maya knew she couldn't stay away any longer. It wasn't in her nature to abandon those she loved when they needed her most. On this particular evening, Maya found herself walking into a local gym. It wasn't a glossy, high-end fitness center with rows of gleaming equipment and an endless playlist of pop music. No, this was a gritty, no-frills boxing gym tucked into the corner of a run-down block. The scent of sweat and old leather hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint sound of gloves striking heavy bags. This place reminded her of the training facility she had used during her military days: functional, raw and honest. She wasn't here for luxury, she was here to release the pent-up tension that had been building since her return. The gym wasn't crowded, just a handful of regulars spread out across the floor. A young man in his 20s practiced jabs in front of a cracked mirror, his footwork uneven but determined. An older woman in her 50s shadowboxed in the corner, her movements deliberate and precise, while a trainer barked corrections from behind her. Maya walked past them, her presence drawing a few curious glances. Dressed in simple workout gear, a plain black tank top and grey sweatpants, she looked unassuming, but her commanding posture hinted at her capabilities. She wasn't there to make friends or prove a point. She simply wanted to focus on the rhythm of her punches and the clarity that came with each strike. As she wrapped her hands and approached one of the heavy bags, Maya felt a familiar sense of calm wash over her. The repetitive motion of preparing for training, the tactile sensation of tightening the wraps, and the anticipation of physical exertion, it was all like a ritual, a way to ground herself. She began with slow, deliberate punches, each strike precise and controlled. The thud of her gloves against the bag echoed through the gym, a steady rhythm that soon drew the attention of those around her. There was something magnetic about the way she moved, each punch delivered with perfect form, each motion a testament to years of discipline. Unbeknownst to Maya, her presence had caught the eye of someone outside the gym. Officer Zach Harper, sitting in his patrol car across the street, had been watching her through the wide glass-paned windows. Zach was a man who wore his discontent like a badge of honor. Once an ambitious rookie with dreams of making a difference, he had grown bitter over the years, his idealism eroded by the grind of routine patrols and a string of personal failures. His recent transfer to this problem area, as it was called, felt like a punishment, a demotion disguised as a lateral move. In his eyes, this neighborhood was just another breeding ground for trouble, a place where people didn't belong unless they fit a certain mold. And Maya, with her confident demeanor and intense focus, didn't fit. From his vantage point, Zach studied her with a mix of suspicion and irritation. Who was this woman? She didn't look like a local, at least not the kind he was used to encountering here. Her sharp movements, and self-assured presence felt out of place in a gym that catered to people just trying to get by. He couldn't articulate why, but something about her set him on edge. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely unfazed by her surroundings, or the fact that she moved with a purpose that hinted at a life far removed from this rundown part of town. Whatever the reason, Zach couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. His mind raced with assumptions, each one feeding into his growing sense of irritation. Maybe she was here to intimidate someone. Maybe she had ties to the kind of people he believed were responsible for the neighborhood's decline. The truth didn't matter as much as the narrative he had already constructed in his head. Zach prided himself on his instincts, and tonight, his instincts told him that this woman was trouble. He stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his utility belt as he crossed the street. The weight of his badge felt heavier than usual, as if it carried not just authority, but the burden of his own frustrations. Inside the gym, Maya continued her routine, oblivious to the figure approaching the door. Her punches grew faster, more forceful, as she settled into the rhythm of her training. Each strike was a release, a way to channel the emotions she rarely allowed herself to express. The years of military discipline had taught her to compartmentalize, to bury her feelings deep beneath a veneer of control. But in moments like this, when it was just her and the bag, she allowed herself the luxury of letting go. When the door swung open, letting in a gust of cool night air, Maya didn't pay much attention. People came and went, it wasn't unusual. But the sudden shift in the room's energy was impossible to ignore. Conversations hushed, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder in the absence of chatter. Maya paused mid-punch, her fists still raised, as she turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. Standing just inside the doorway was Zach, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto hers. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. Maya lowered her gloves, her gaze steady as she took in the man before her. She didn't know who he was, but something about his presence felt confrontational. Zach, for his part, was already formulating his approach. To him, this wasn't just a routine stop, it was a test of authority, a chance to assert control over a situation that didn't sit right with him. As he stepped further into the gym, the weight of the impending confrontation hung heavy in the air, a silent promise of the storm that was about to unfold. The air in the gym seemed to grow heavier as Officer Zach Harper made his way toward Maya Steele. His steps were deliberate, his boots thudding against the scuffed wooden floor with a rhythm that echoed his simmering frustration. Conversations in the gym, once lively and animated, had fallen silent, leaving only the faint sound of the heavy bag swaying slightly in the corner. The patrons who had been focused on their workouts now stood frozen in place, their curiosity and apprehension directed toward the scene unfolding before them. Maya, however, remained calm, her breathing steady as she unwrapped her hands with slow precision. Her movements showed no sign of urgency or nervousness, only the measured demeanor of someone who had seen worse confrontations and lived to tell the tale. Zach's eyes locked onto hers, narrowing slightly as he assessed her with a mix of suspicion and disdain. To him, her composed demeanor wasn't a sign of discipline or confidence, it was defiance. In his mind, her calmness was a challenge, a refusal to acknowledge the authority he believed he represented. The uniform he wore, the badge clipped to his chest, and the gun holstered at his side were all symbols of control and respect. Yet in Maya's steady gaze he found none of the nervousness or submission he was used to. It irritated him. More than that, it ignited something deeper, an ugly resentment that he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. Zach was no stranger to confrontation, but this felt different. This wasn't a scenario he could dominate with his presence alone, and that realization gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. "Excuse me," Zach called out, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. It wasn't a polite greeting or even a genuine question, it was a demand. His tone carried the weight of authority, sharpened by years of using it to force compliance. Maya finished unwrapping her hands, her movements unhurried, before turning to face him fully. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable, as if she were waiting for him to say something of actual substance. For a moment their gazes locked, the space between them charged with an unspoken tension that everyone in the gym could feel. "Can I help you with something?" Maya finally asked, her voice calm and even. There was no trace of hostility, but neither was there the deference Zach expected. Her words were polite, but they lacked the submissive undertone he was accustomed to hearing when addressing people in this part of town. That alone was enough to set his teeth on edge. To him, it felt like a subtle jab, a refusal to acknowledge his authority outright. Zach crossed his arms, his stance widening slightly as he positioned himself as the dominant figure in the room. "Yeah, I've got a question," he said, his tone sharp and confrontational. "What are you doing here?" Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression unchanging. "Training," she replied simply, gesturing toward the heavy bag behind her. "Same as everyone else in this gym." Her response only deepened Zach's irritation. There was something about the simplicity of her answer, the way she didn't feel the need to explain herself further, that felt like a slap in the face. He had expected her to stumble, to fumble for excuses, or show some sign of unease. Instead, she stood before him with the poise of someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. It was infuriating. "And you think you belong here?" Zach asked, his words laced with sarcasm. His gaze swept over her, scrutinizing every detail of her appearance, as if searching for something to justify his growing hostility. "You don't look like someone from around here." Maya's expression didn't waver, but a flicker of something amusement, perhaps, glimmered in her eyes. "I didn't realize gyms had residency requirements," she replied evenly. "Do I need to show you my membership card, or is this just your way of saying hello?" A few muffled snickers echoed from the back of the gym, quickly silenced by Zach's sharp glare. His face flushed slightly, the color rising to his cheeks as he clenched his jaw. He was losing control of the narrative, and he hated it. For a man like Zach, authority wasn't just a tool, it was a shield, a way to mask the insecurities he carried deep inside. But with every passing second, it became increasingly clear that Maya wasn't intimidated by his uniform or his demeanor. She wasn't playing along, and it left him grasping for a way to regain the upper hand. "Watch your tone," Zach snapped, his voice rising slightly. "I'm asking you a question. What's your business here?" Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. For the first time, there was a hint of steel in her voice as she replied, "I told you. I'm training. That's my business. If you've got a problem with that, maybe you should explain why you're here, interrupting everyone else's workout." The shift in her tone sent a ripple through the room. The patrons who had been quietly observing the exchange now exchanged glances, their unease growing. It was clear to everyone that this wasn't a casual conversation, it was a power struggle. And while Maya's calm demeanor suggested she had no intention of escalating the situation, it was equally clear that she wasn't backing down. Zach took a step closer, his posture rigid as he loomed over her. "You'd better watch yourself," he warned, his voice low and menacing. "I don't take kindly to disrespect." Maya didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed even more composed, her gaze unwavering as she met his glare head-on. "Neither do I," she said quietly. The weight of her words hung in the air, a subtle challenge that Zach couldn't ignore. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Zach's hand twitched at his side, a reflexive gesture that hinted at his growing frustration. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone like her. And yet, despite his mounting anger, he couldn't deny the uncomfortable truth staring him in the face. Maya Steele wasn't afraid of him. "All right, that's enough," Zach barked, breaking the silence. "Step outside. We're going to have a little chat." Maya's eyes narrowed, her calm exterior giving way to a flicker of annoyance. "Is that an order, officer?" she asked, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "Because unless you've got a legitimate reason to detain me, I suggest you move on. I'm not interested in wasting my time with whatever this is." The tension in the room reached a boiling point as Zach took another step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore, his judgment clouded by the need to assert control over a situation that was rapidly slipping away from him. The gym's patrons began to shift uneasily, some taking cautious steps back while others whispered among themselves. But Maya didn't move. She stood her ground, her posture steady and unyielding as she stared Zach down. It was a battle of wills, and for the first time in a long time, Zach felt himself faltering. The badge on his chest, the weight of his authority, none of it seemed to matter in the face of her unwavering confidence. And that realization only made him angrier. "Fine," Zach growled through gritted teeth. "You want to play games? Let's see how tough you really are." Maya's gaze didn't waver as Zach stood in front of her, his posture radiating aggression. She could see the fire in his eyes, a mix of frustration and a bruised ego driving his every move. This wasn't about her being out of place, or him doing his job. This was personal. Zach Harper was a man who thrived on control, and Maya, standing her ground with unshakable composure, was a threat to that control. The room around them seemed to shrink, the heavy silence amplifying the tension between the two. Zach stepped closer, closing the distance between them. His hand hovered near his belt, an unspoken threat, as if to remind Maya of the authority he believed his uniform bestowed upon him. Maya, however, remained still, her eyes locked on his, her body relaxed but ready. Years of military training had taught her how to read people, to anticipate their next move before they even knew what they were going to do. Zach's body language screamed insecurity masquerading as dominance, and Maya knew exactly how this was going to play out if she didn't maintain her control. "You think you're tough, don't you?" Zach's voice dripped with condescension, but there was a crack in his tone, a hint of uncertainty that betrayed him. "Walking in here like you own the place, acting like the rules don't apply to you." Maya raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm not acting like anything, officer. I came here to train, just like everyone else in this gym. The only person breaking the peace here is you." Her words, measured and deliberate, hit Zach like a slap in the face. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as he struggled to keep his composure. The onlookers in the gym shuffled nervously, their eyes darting between Maya and Zach, unsure of what would happen next. No one dared to intervene, the weight of the confrontation pinning them in place like statues. "I'm not here to debate with you," Zach snapped, his voice rising. "You're going to step outside with me right now, or we're going to have a problem." Maya let out a quiet breath, her patience wearing thin. She had tried to de-escalate, to give Zach the chance to walk away with whatever shred of dignity he had left. But it was clear that wasn't going to happen. Men like B. Zach Harper didn't back down easily, especially not when their authority was challenged in front of an audience. He wasn't going to let this go, no matter how unreasonable he was being. "Officer," Maya said, her voice steady and controlled, "I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing right now. You're about to cross a line you can't uncross." Her words, though calm, carried an edge that Zach didn't miss. To the onlookers, she seemed perfectly composed, But those who were paying close attention, those who had been in real fights before, could see the subtle shift in her stance. Maya wasn't just standing her ground, she was preparing for whatever might come next. Her weight shifted slightly, her feet planted firmly, her muscles relaxed but coiled like a spring. She wasn't going to make the first move, but if Zach escalated, she would be ready. But Zach wasn't paying attention to the warning signs. All he could see was someone he perceived as defiant, someone who wasn't giving him the respect he thought he deserved. He clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration bubbling over into anger. His voice dropped, his tone menacing. "You're coming with me. Now." When Maya didn't move, Zach took another step forward, closing the gap between them until they were nearly nose to nose. His chest puffed out as he loomed over her, trying to intimidate her into compliance. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she looked him straight in the eye, her calm gaze unwavering. "I don't respond well to threats," she said evenly. Her voice was low, steady, and it carried the weight of someone who had faced far greater dangers than a power-tripping cop. "And you're making a mistake if you think I'm going to let you push me around." Zach's patience snapped. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Maya's arm, his grip tight and forceful. The sudden move drew gasps from the onlookers, a few of whom instinctively took a step back, their unease turning to outright alarm. But Maya didn't panic. She didn't pull away or struggle. Instead, she let out a quiet breath, her expression hardening as she looked down at his hand on her arm. "That," she said, her voice calm but cold, "was your second mistake." Before Zach could react, Maya moved. It happened so quickly that most of the people watching didn't even register what had happened until it was over. In one fluid motion, Maya twisted her arm free from Zach's grip, her movements precise and efficient. Using his momentum against him, she stepped to the side and hooked her leg behind his, sending him stumbling off balance. As he flailed, she pressed her forearm against his chest, using his own weight to drive him backward until he crashed against the wall of the gym. The impact knocked the air out of Zach's lungs, and for a moment he was too stunned to react. Maya didn't let up. She held him there, her forearm pinning him in place, her other hand resting lightly on his wrist, controlling his movements without causing unnecessary harm. She wasn't trying to hurt him, just to neutralize the threat he posed. The gym fell silent, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. The patrons watched in stunned disbelief, their eyes darting between Maya and Zach as they tried to process what they had just seen. Some of them looked impressed, others looked terrified. But no one said a word. "Let me make something very clear," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. Her face was inches from Zach's, her eyes boring into his with a piercing intensity. "You're not in control here. You lost control the moment you let your ego get the better of you." Zach's face turned red, a mix of anger and humiliation burning through him as he struggled against her hold. But no matter how much he twisted and squirmed, he couldn't break free. Maya's grip was too strong, her technique too practiced. She had done this 1,000 times before, in far more dangerous situations, against far more formidable opponents. To her, Zach was just another obstacle to be managed. "You don't know who you're messing with," Zach growled, his voice strained. His eyes darted around the room, looking for some kind of backup. But no one stepped forward. Even his colleagues, who might have been inclined to support him in other circumstances, seemed hesitant to intervene. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm messing with," Maya replied coolly. "A man who doesn't understand the difference between authority and power. And right now you're learning the hard way that your badge doesn't make you invincible." Zach clenched his teeth, his frustration boiling over into rage. He lunged forward, trying to break free, but Maya anticipated the move. She shifted her weight, using his own momentum to redirect him downward. In the blink of an eye, Zach found himself face down on the ground, his arm twisted behind his back in a controlled hold that left him immobilized but unharmed. Maya leaned down, her voice calm but laced with warning. "Stay down, officer," she said. "This is over. Don't make it worse for yourself." Zach let out a frustrated growl, his pride wounded far more than his body. For a moment it looked like he might try to fight back again, but the weight of the situation finally seemed to catch up to him. He went still, his breathing heavy as he glared at the floor beneath him. Maya straightened, releasing her hold and stepping back, but her eyes remained locked on Zach, her body still poised and ready to react if he made another move. She wasn't taking any chances. Men like Zach didn't let go of their anger easily, and she knew better than to underestimate him. The silence in the gym was broken by a soft murmur as the patrons began to stir, their initial shock giving way to a mix of awe and unease. No one seemed quite sure what to do or say. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that felt almost surreal in its intensity. Maya turned to the onlookers, her expression softening slightly as she addressed them. "It's all right," she said. "You're safe. Go back to what you were doing." Her words seemed to snap them out of their daze. Slowly, cautiously, the patrons began to return to their workouts, though the tension in the air lingered like an invisible weight. Some of them cast glances at Zach, who was still on the ground, his face twisted in a mix of anger and humiliation. Zach pushed himself up, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at Maya as he stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His pride had taken a beating, and he wasn't going to let it go. But he also wasn't stupid enough to escalate things further, not now, not with so many witnesses. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Maya heard him, but she didn't react. She simply stood there, calm and composed, watching as he turned and stormed out of the gym. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the space like a final punctuation mark to the confrontation. As the tension began to dissipate, Maya let out a quiet breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She turned back to the heavy bag, her focus shifting back to her training. Whatever fallout awaited her after this, she would deal with it when the time came. For now, she had more important things to focus on. The air outside the gym was cooler than it had been earlier, but it did little to temper the fire burning in Officer Zach Harper's chest as he stormed back to his patrol car. His mind raced, replaying the confrontation over and over again. The humiliation of being bested, not just physically but mentally, in front of a crowd was more than he could handle. He slammed the car door shut with a force that made the vehicle tremble, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could still feel the weight of Maya Steele's words, her calm yet cutting tone, her absolute control over the situation. It was like she had stripped him bare, exposing his vulnerabilities in a way that made him feel powerless and enraged. "This isn't over," Zach muttered under his breath, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. He wasn't the type to let things go, especially not something that felt like a direct challenge to his authority. In his mind, she had mocked him, undermined him, and, worst of all, made him look weak. The fact that she had done it without breaking a sweat only made it worse. His ego demanded retribution, a way to reassert his dominance and prove that he was still in control. Zach sat in the car, his mind spinning as he considered his options. He couldn't just let this slide, not after what had happened. But the rational part of his brain reminded him that there were witnesses, people who had seen everything, and could easily back up her version of events if he tried to push this too far. He needed to be smart about this, to find a way to turn the situation to his advantage without drawing too much attention to himself. And then it came to him a plan, reckless and impulsive, but one that might just work if he played his cards right. Grabbing his radio, Zach called in a vague report to dispatch, carefully framing it in a way that made it sound like he was pursuing someone dangerous. "Dispatch, this is Harper," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "I need backup on a possible suspect involved in a disturbance. Female, late 30s, athletic build. Last seen heading west on foot from the corner of Ridge and Oak. Possible resistance expected." He didn't mention her name or provide any details that could tie this to the gym incident. He wanted it to sound official, like a legitimate call for assistance, not a personal vendetta. He knew how to work the system, how to manipulate language and procedure to suit his needs. It wasn't the first time he'd bent the rules to get what he wanted, and it wouldn't be the last. This time, however, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about salvaging his pride. As the radio crackled with the acknowledgement from dispatch, Zach started the car and pulled away from the curb. He knew where Maya would be headed. The gym was in a quieter part of town, not far from the residential area where she likely lived. It wouldn't take long to catch up to her. His pulse quickened at the thought, a mix of anticipation and anger driving him forward. He would make her regret crossing him, one way or another. Meanwhile, Maya Steele was walking away from the gym, her steps measured and unhurried. She could feel the tension from the confrontation still lingering in her muscles, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had dealt with men like Zach Harper before, men who believed their authority made them untouchable, who saw any challenge to their dominance as a personal affront. They were predictable in their reactions, and that predictability made them dangerous. Maya had no illusions about what might happen next. She knew Zach wouldn't let this go. The look in his eyes as he left the gym had told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. But she wasn't afraid. Years of military service had taught her how to stay composed under pressure, how to anticipate and adapt to threats in real time. She wasn't just a fighter, she was a strategist, and she was already planning her next move. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention away from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a text from her mother. "Hope your training went well. Don't forget to pick up dinner on your way back." Maya smiled faintly, the simplicity of the message grounding her in the moment. Her mother had always had a way of cutting through the noise, reminding Maya of what really mattered. She quickly typed a response, assuring her mother that she'd be home soon, and slipped the phone back into her pocket. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement as Maya continued walking, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She was alert, her senses tuned to her surroundings, but she didn't let it show. She walked with the same calm confidence she always carried, her posture relaxed but ready. It was a habit ingrained in her from years of training, a way of projecting strength without inviting confrontation. She didn't have to wait long for the sound of a car engine to break the stillness. Maya's ears caught the faint hum before she saw the vehicle, her instincts immediately kicking in. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the patrol car approaching, its headlights cutting through the darkness. She knew it was him. Of course it was him. The car slowed as it pulled alongside her, the passenger window rolling down to reveal Zach's face. His expression was a mask of professionalism, but his eyes betrayed the storm brewing beneath the surface. He called out, his tone clipped and formal. "I need you to stop right there." Maya paused, turning to face him with an expression of mild curiosity. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing any hint of fear or unease. "Just a few questions," Zach said, stepping out of the car. He kept his movements deliberate, his hand resting near his belt, as if to remind her of his authority. We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. You fit the description of someone we're looking for. Maya raised an eyebrow, her gaze steady. Suspicious activity, she repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. I just left the gym. Unless working out is considered suspicious now, I think you might have the wrong person. Zach's jaw tightened at her response, his irritation bubbling to the surface. I'll be the judge of that, he snapped. I need to see some ID. Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She could see the game he was playing, the way he was trying to reassert control after losing it so spectacularly earlier. But she wasn't going to let him manipulate her into compliance. She had rights, and she wasn't about to let him trample over them. With all due respect, Officer Maya said, her voice measured, you don't have a legitimate reason to stop me. I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not obligated to show you my ID without probable cause. Zach's face flushed red, his frustration boiling over. He took a step closer, his posture rigid with barely contained anger. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, he growled. You're already in enough trouble as it is. Maya stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. The only one making this harder is you, she replied. Now, unless you have something concrete to say, I suggest you move on. I have nothing more to discuss. The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity, the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. Zach's fists clenched at his sides, his body language screaming his desire to escalate. But Maya remained calm, her posture unyielding, her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity that seemed to unnerve him more than anything else. Finally, Zach stepped back, his face a mask of barely restrained rage. This isn't over, he spat, his voice low and venomous. He turned and stalked back to his car, slamming the door behind him before speeding off into the night. Maya watched him go, her expression unreadable. She knew this was far from the end. Zach Harper wasn't the type to back down easily, and she had no doubt he would try again. But she wasn't worried. She had faced worse threats than him, and she would face this one with the same unwavering resolve. As she turned and continued walking, her mind was already working through the possibilities, calculating her next steps. She wasn't just going to wait for him to make his move, she was going to be ready for him when he did. And when that moment came, she would show him once and for all that his authority didn't intimidate her, and his attempts to control her would only end in his own downfall. Zach Harper sat in his patrol car, his jaw clenched so tightly it felt like his teeth might crack under the pressure. His fingers tapped restlessly against the steering wheel, the only outlet for the seething anger that boiled beneath his skin. Maya Steele had not only humiliated him twice in the span of a single evening, but had done so with an infuriating calmness that made him feel utterly powerless. It wasn't just about the confrontation in the gym or even the icy exchange on the street. It was about control that had slipped through his fingers, leaving him with nothing but his bruised ego and an overwhelming need to reassert himself. Zach's mind churned with thoughts, each more vindictive than the last. He knew he couldn't let this go, not now. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about what she represented. To him, Maya Steele was the embodiment of defiance, a direct challenge to everything he thought he stood for. She hadn't just dismissed him, she had stripped him of his authority in front of witnesses, exposing the fragile foundation on which his confidence was built. That couldn't go unanswered. He reached for his radio, his fingers hovering over the buttons as he considered his next move. He needed to be careful. If he made this look like a personal vendetta, it would backfire spectacularly. But Zach was no stranger to bending the rules when it suited him. He had done it before, framing his actions as procedural necessity, masking his motivations behind the guise of protecting the community. This time would be no different. He keyed the radio, his voice steady and measured despite the fury coursing through him. "Dispatch, this is Officer Harper," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "I've got a situation developing with a potential suspect, requesting additional units for assistance." The dispatcher's voice crackled back over the line. "Copy that, Officer Harper. Can you provide details on the suspect and situation?" Zach paused, crafting his response carefully. Female, late 30s, athletic build. Potentially aggressive. She's been uncooperative and is refusing to identify herself. Last seen heading toward the residential area near Oak and Monroe. I believe she may pose a safety risk. The words came easily, each one a calculated move in the game he was playing. He knew how to frame the narrative, how to manipulate the system to serve his agenda. By the time backup arrived, they would already see Maya as a threat, someone to be subdued rather than reasoned with. He'd have the advantage, and she'd have no choice but to comply. The thought sent a flicker of satisfaction through him, a brief respite from the gnawing frustration that had consumed him all evening. While Zach was putting his plan into motion, Maya was walking the quiet streets of her neighborhood, her footsteps steady and unhurried despite the events of the night. She could feel the tension still lingering in her muscles, a reminder of the confrontation she had endured. But Maya wasn't rattled. If anything, she was more focused than ever, her mind sharp as she considered what might come next. She knew Zach wouldn't let this go. Men like him rarely did. His pride had been wounded, and that kind of injury didn't heal easily. He would come after her again, of that she was certain. But Maya wasn't worried. She had spent years dealing with men who thought they could use their authority to intimidate or control her. She had seen their type before, arrogant, entitled, and utterly unprepared for the reality of facing someone who wouldn't back down. Zach Harper was no different. As she approached her home, Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a text from an old friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in months. The timing was unexpected, but the message brought a faint smile to her lips. It was a reminder of the support system she had built over the years, the people who had her back even when things got tough. She responded quickly, tucking the phone away as she reached her front door. Maya had barely stepped inside when she heard the distant sound of sirens. Her body tensed instinctively, her military training kicking in as she assessed the situation. The sirens were getting louder, closer, and there was no mistaking their destination. She moved to the window, peeking through the blinds to see the flashing lights of patrol cars pulling up in front of her house. Her jaw tightened as she spotted Zach stepping out of one of the cars, flanked by two other officers. His expression was a mix of smug satisfaction and barely contained rage, his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed they were finally back in control. Maya let out a slow breath, steadying herself. She knew this was coming, but seeing it unfold in real time still sent a wave of anger coursing through her. Zach was escalating, taking this beyond anything remotely reasonable, and she would have to deal with it. But Maya wasn't the type to panic. She had faced far worse than a handful of overzealous cops, and she wasn't about to let them rattle her. There was a sharp knock at the door, followed by Zach's voice. "MS, Steele. This is the police. We need to speak with you." Maya took a moment to compose herself before opening the door. Her expression was calm, her posture relaxed but firm as she met Zach's gaze. "What can I do for you, officer?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with steel. Zach stepped forward, his smirk widening as he held up a notepad. "We've had reports of suspicious behavior, and you match the description of someone we've been looking for. I'm going to need you to come with us for questioning." Maya raised an eyebrow, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Suspicious behavior," she repeated. That's interesting considering I've been walking home from the gym and minding my own business. Unless working out is a crime now, I fail to see what I've done to warrant your attention. Zach's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. That's not for you to decide, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Now, are you going to cooperate, or are we going to have a problem? Maya crossed her arms, her gaze steady. I'm happy to cooperate if you can provide a legitimate reason for detaining me, she said. But I'm not going anywhere until you do. The tension between them was palpable, the other officers shifting uncomfortably as they watched the exchange. One of them, a younger man with a hesitant expression, seemed to sense that something was off. He glanced between Zach and Maya, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the scene. But he said nothing, his silence a reflection of the unspoken rule that loyalty to one's partner outweighed personal doubts. Zach's patience snapped. I'm not going to ask again, he said, his voice rising. Step outside now. Maya held his gaze, her expression hardening. She could feel the adrenaline building, her body preparing for what was to come. If you want to take this further, she said quietly, you'd better be sure you're ready for the consequences. Zach didn't hesitate. He reached for her arm, his grip firm as he tried to pull her forward. But Maya was faster. Before he could fully react, she twisted out of his grasp, her movements fluid and precise. She stepped to the side, her hands raised in a defensive posture as she locked eyes with him. That she said, her voice cold and steady, was your last mistake. The other officers froze, their hands hovering near their belts as they watched the scene unfold. Zach's face turned red, his anger boiling over as he lunged at her again. But Maya was ready. She sidestepped his attack, using his momentum against him to send him stumbling forward. With a swift, controlled motion, she hooked her arm around his and brought him to the ground, pinning him there with minimal effort. The younger officer stepped forward, his voice shaky as he tried to intervene. Please. Maya cut him off, her tone sharp but calm. Stand down. This isn't about you. She looked down at Zach, her grip firm but not aggressive. You've been looking for a fight all night, she said quietly. And now you've got one. But it's not going to end the way you think it will. Zach struggled beneath her, his pride wounded far more than his body. The other officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to proceed. The standoff stretched on, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Finally, Maya released him, stepping back and raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. If you want to arrest me, she said, her voice steady, go ahead. But you'd better be damn sure you can justify it. Zach climbed to his feet, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out again, but the presence of his colleagues held him back. He straightened his uniform, his hands trembling as he glared at her. This isn't over, he growled, his voice low and venomous. Maya didn't respond. She simply stood there, calm and unyielding, as he turned and walked away. The other officers followed, their silence a testament to the tension that hung in the air. As the patrol cars pulled away, Maya let out a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She knew this wasn't the end. Zach Harper wasn't the type to give up easily, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had faced worse, and she would face this too. Maya Steele watched the patrol cars disappear into the distance, the faint glow of their taillights fading into the night. She stood on her porch, her hands resting on the wooden railing, her breathing steady but her mind racing. The confrontation had escalated beyond what she had anticipated, and now the situation was reaching a boiling point. She knew that Zach Harper wasn't finished. Men like him, driven by bruised egos and unchecked authority, never let things go. They pushed until they broke something or someone. But Maya had no intention of breaking. Not now, not ever. Inside her house, the lights were dim, casting long shadows across the modest furniture and the neatly arranged photos of her family. Maya took a moment to center herself, closing her eyes and drawing in a deep breath. Her training had taught her how to compartmentalize, how to focus on the task at hand, even when chaos threatened to overwhelm her. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about principle, about standing up to a system that allowed people like Zach Harper to operate unchecked. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She knew exactly who to call. Captain Brian O'Connor, head of the precinct where Zach Harper worked, was an old acquaintance. Maya had crossed paths with him years ago during a joint training operation between the military and law enforcement. O'Connor had struck her as a fair man, someone who valued integrity and discipline over blind loyalty. If anyone would listen to her and handle this situation appropriately, it would be him. The phone rang twice before O'Connor picked up, his voice gruff but alert. "Steele. It's been a while. What's going on?" Maya wasted no time. "Brian, I need your help. One of your officers, Zach Harper, has been harassing me all night. He crossed the line, and it's only getting worse. I need this handled before it escalates any further." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Maya could almost hear O'Connor processing what she had just said. "Harper," he muttered, his tone heavy with frustration. "I've had complaints about him before, but nothing solid enough to act on. Tell me exactly what happened." Maya recounted the events of the evening in meticulous detail, her voice steady but laced with controlled anger. She described the initial encounter at the gym, the escalation on the street, and the outright abuse of power when he showed up at her house with backup. O'Connor listened in silence, occasionally muttering a curse under his breath. By the time she finished, his voice was tight with resolve. "All right," he said. "I'll handle it. But Steele, you know this isn't just about him, right? If Harper's acting like this, it's because he thinks he can get away with it. The problem runs deeper than one bad officer." Maya nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I know. That's why I'm not backing down. This needs to stop, not just for me, but for everyone who's been on the receiving end of this kind of behavior." O'Connor sighed. "I'll meet you at the station. Bring whatever evidence you have and we'll take it from there." Maya hung up the phone and immediately began gathering what she needed. She pulled a small body camera from her bag, a habit she had developed during her years in the military. It had captured the entire encounter with Zach at her house, including his attempts to grab her and her subsequent takedown of him. She also retrieved a flash drive containing footage from the gym where a security camera had recorded their initial confrontation. She didn't want there to be any room for doubt or misinterpretation. The truth would speak for itself. By the time she arrived at the precinct, it was nearly midnight. The building was quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the empty desks and tiled floors. O'Connor was waiting for her near the entrance, his broad frame filling the doorway. He looked tired but determined, his sharp eyes narrowing as she approached. "Steele," he said, nodding in greeting. "Let's get this sorted." He led her into a conference room where two other senior officers were already seated, their expressions neutral but curious. Maya recognized one of them as Lieutenant Karen Morales, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for rooting out misconduct within the department. The other was Sergeant David Fields, whose calm demeanor belied his reputation as a sharp investigator. Together, they made an imposing team. "All right," Steele O'Connor said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "Let's see what you've got." Maya placed the body camera and flash drive on the table, her movements deliberate. "This is everything you need to see," she said. "I don't want there to be any ambiguity about what happened tonight. O'Connor nodded to Morales, who picked up the flash drive and inserted it into a laptop. The room fell silent as the footage began to play, the tension thickening with every passing second. The video from the gym showed Zach's aggressive approach, his escalating hostility, and Maya's calm but firm responses. The body camera footage captured the confrontation at her house in vivid detail, including Zach's attempts to manhandle her and her precise, controlled takedown of him. By the time the videos ended, the room was heavy with unspoken tension. O'Connor leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched as he processed what he had just seen. Morales shook her head, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. Fields remained silent, his sharp eyes fixed on the screen, as if searching for some detail he might have missed. "This is bad," Morales said finally, breaking the silence. "Harper's completely out of line. This isn't just a lapse in judgment, it's a pattern of behavior." O'Connor nodded, his face grim. "And it's one I've let go on for too long. That ends tonight." He turned to Maya, his expression softening slightly. "Steele, I owe you an apology. This should have been dealt with a long time ago. Harper's actions don't reflect the values of this department, and I'll make sure he's held accountable." Maya nodded, her gaze steady. "That's all. I wanted to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else." O'Connor stood, his movements deliberate as he straightened his uniform. "I'll deal with Harper personally. Morales, start drafting the paperwork for an internal investigation. Fields, I want a report on my desk by morning. Steele, you're free to go, but if you need anything at all, you call me." Maya rose from her seat, her posture as composed as ever. "Thank you, Brian. I appreciate it." As she left the precinct, a sense of calm finally began to settle over her. The night had been long, and the battle was far from over, but she had taken the first step toward holding Zach Harper accountable. It wasn't just about justice, it was about sending a message that abuse of power wouldn't be tolerated, no matter who was involved. For Maya, the fight wasn't over. But tonight she had won. And that was enough. For now. The morning sunlight streamed through the window of Maya Steele's modest kitchen, casting a warm glow across the table where she sat, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The events of the previous night played through her mind in vivid detail, each confrontation, each escalation, each calculated move she had made to ensure she stayed in control of a situation that could have spiraled out of hand. It wasn't the first time Maya had faced someone like Zach Harper, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But this time, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps something real might come from the stand she had taken. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a text from Captain Brian O'Connor. "Harper has been officially suspended. The internal investigation is underway. I'll keep you updated." Maya read the message twice, letting the weight of it sink in. She had expected resistance, denial, or excuses, but O'Connor's swift action gave her a sense of vindication. For the first time in a long time, someone in a position of authority had listened and acted. Still, Maya knew this was only the beginning. Removing one officer wasn't enough to fix a system that allowed men like Zach to thrive. The problem ran deeper than one person, and the solution would require more than a single disciplinary action. But at least it was a start. She took a long sip of her coffee, the warmth grounding her as she began to think about her next steps. Later that day, Maya decided to return to the gym. It wasn't about proving a point or making a statement. Training was her way of finding balance, of staying sharp and centered. When she walked through the doors, the familiar scent of sweat and leather greeted her, along with the curious stares of the regulars who had witnessed the confrontation the night before. Conversations quieted as people noticed her presence, their eyes flickering with a mix of respect and uncertainty. One of the trainers, a wiry man in his 40s named Marco, approached her with a cautious smile. "Maya," he said, his voice warm but tentative. "Good to see you back. I wasn't sure if you'd come after. You know." Maya shrugged, her expression calm. "I don't scare off that easily, Marco. You know that." Marco chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Yeah, I figured. Look, I just want to say, what you did last night, standing up to that guy, it was impressive. A lot of people wouldn't have had the guts to do what you did." "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," Maya said simply. "I just did what needed to be done." Marco nodded, his smile fading slightly. "Well, you made an impression anyway. People are still talking about it. Hell, I've been getting calls from folks asking about you, wondering who you are, what you do." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, half of them think I'm some kind of troublemaker, and the other half think I'm a vigilante." Marco laughed. "Something like that. But most of them just want to know how they can learn to stand up for themselves like you did." The comment caught Maya off guard. She hadn't considered that her actions might inspire others. For her, it had been about survival, about maintaining her dignity in the face of abuse. But if others could draw strength from what she had done, then maybe it was worth more than just a personal victory. As the day went on, more people approached her, some offering quiet words of support, others asking about self-defense techniques or tips for staying composed in high-pressure situations. Maya answered their questions as best she could, her natural instinct as a mentor and leader kicking in. By the time she left the gym, she was already forming a plan in her mind. A week later, Maya stood in front of a small group of men and women at a local community center. The room was plain, with beige walls and folding chairs arranged in a loose circle, but the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Word had spread about her confrontation with Zach Harper, and people had started reaching out to her, asking for guidance. Some were victims of similar abuses of power, while others were simply eager to learn how to protect themselves in a world that often felt unpredictable and unsafe. Maya looked around the room, taking in the diverse faces that stared back at her. There were young people, older adults, men, women, each of them carrying their own stories, their own reasons for being there. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not here to preach or to pretend I have all the answers. I'm here because I believe that no one should feel powerless in the face of intimidation or injustice. What happened to me last week wasn't unique. It happens every day, to people all over the world. And while we can't change the system overnight, we can change how we respond to it." She paused, letting her words sink in. "What I want to do is give you tools, not just physical tools, but mental and emotional ones. I want to teach you how to stay calm under pressure, how to assert your rights without escalating the situation, and how to protect yourself if things do get physical. Because the truth is, sometimes standing up for yourself is the only option you have." Over the next hour, Maya walked them through the basics of situational awareness, conflict de-escalation, and self-defense techniques. She demonstrated how to read body language, how to maintain a safe distance, and how to use leverage and precision to overcome a stronger opponent. The group watched intently, their focus unwavering as they absorbed every word, every movement. By the end of the session, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. What had started as nervous curiosity had transformed into a sense of empowerment. People who had walked in with hunched shoulders and uncertain gazes now stood a little taller, their expressions more confident. Maya could see the change in them, and it filled her with a quiet sense of pride. As the group began to disperse, one woman lingered behind, her brow furrowed with thought. She was in her late 30s, with tired eyes and a hesitant smile. "Maya," she said, her voice soft, Can I ask you something? Of course, Maya replied, her tone warm. The woman hesitated, then said, How do you stay so calm? Even when things get really bad, how do you keep it together? Maya considered the question for a moment before answering. It's not about not feeling fear or anger, she said. It's about learning how to channel those emotions into something productive. When you've been through enough, you realize that panic and rage don't help, they just make things worse. Staying calm isn't always easy, but it's a skill, just like anything else. And the more you practice it, the stronger you get. The woman nodded, her smile growing a little steadier. Thank you, she said. For everything. As the woman left, Maya stood alone in the empty room, her thoughts drifting back to that night with Zach Harper. The fallout from the investigation was still unfolding, and she didn't know how it would end. But for now, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced the storm and come out stronger, and in doing so, she had sparked something in others, a desire to stand up, to fight back, to reclaim their power. Maya knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more battles to face. But as she looked out the window at the bright blue sky, she felt ready. Whatever came next, she would meet it head-on, with the same unshakable resolve that had carried her through so many trials before. And she would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed someone to show them that they too could be strong.